So before I get on to the Hollow Ones, the final tradition I want to speak about, I want to answer this by Arthur. And it's talking about when two paradigms clash. This is the basest political issue in Mage. This is where a lot of friction happens between the traditions, because when it becomes rigid, the traditions all look at their way of magic as the only way of doing magic, but the higher, more enlightened ones understand that it is not that they have that way of doing magic, but that they can do magic. That's part of what comes with the enlightenment of being higher up. At 8 is a form of enlightenment. It's not just knowledge. It's higher understanding. That's why the higher your 8 goes, the more you can let go of foci for spheres, because you start to understand things greater. There is a lot of political machination that goes on, but that's a sign of very unenlightened beings. And this is usually what causes mages to come to blows with each other, and that's why, and we're going to talk about that later on down the line, there was the idea of Certamen brought up. It was a tradition among the Order of Hermes. It is a type of magical duel. And Certamen is quite often, when mages lock horns, what's decided. Because your grasp of the capability of your magic being better than your opponent simply shows that you have a better understanding. This is one of the frictions, and understand something. You as a player should never feel this way about another player in the game. You shouldn't. Unless they are opposed to the faction you all are a part of. If you're a tradition mage, the idea of the traditions is that you want freedom for everyone from technocratic rule. That doesn't mean that you tolerate nephandic practices, because there's still a moral component to that is grotesque. But if you're going to spend all your time shitting on other players for their paradigms, you don't need to be playing the game. This shouldn't even be a thing. At all. At all. Has it come up at my table? Yes, but in roleplay ways, not in adverse ways. Like, players will argue with each other in a friendly manner that their way of doing magic is superior, and then try to display it. And it becomes that very Legolas Gimli counting kills kind of thing. That's fine. That's fun. Feelings aren't being trod on. Characters aren't being crapped on. But when it becomes a serious issue, you've got a bigger problem at your table than that. You have an asshole at your table. I'm just going to call it what it is. They're an asshole. And it needs to be stopped. These are still cooperative games. And I think people overlook that. I think people have a tendency to have their head too far up their own asses to realize that the point of these games is cooperation to tell a story. They get too much into themselves and wanting to be the shining star of the table, instead of realizing the whole table is meant to work together. Like I've said before, I have kicked people out of my table for it. There's no time, space, reason for it at all to get to that point. Now, as far as NPCs and PCs, that can be a fun conflict. If you've got an NPC that's a bit of a supremacist about his way of doing magic, Now you have a fun little conflict to throw at a player. Perhaps that player tends to get a little snooty about the way they do magic. The Order of Hermes, my favorite tradition, tends to do that. They tend to get a bit snooty. That can be a lot of fun, because now you're creating a conflict for that character against a non-player character. It's not conflict at the table. It's not two people arguing while you're trying to run a game. It's the conflict meant to be in the game. Perhaps that person that thinks their way is falling to Nephandic influence, and they're starting to embrace the Clepothic spheres. Or perhaps they're just an asshole. So no, as far as it falls under the category of player versus player is a no-no at my table. Player versus non-player, sure, go ahead with it, absolutely.